Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations at the National Security Council. She was Secretary Condoleezza Rice's Senior Advisor for Women's Empowerment and led a strategic initiative in the State Department. She's the author of several monographs and will be speaking today about United States democracy promotion and foreign policy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, especially since I have colleagues and friends present in this room. So it's wonderful to be back at Stanford and to talk about a subject that someone said to me yesterday, what exactly does democracy promotion mean in terms of US foreign policy? So in order to structure sort of thoughts on this rather amorphous topic, I have put together sort of a, I guess an academic was always an academic, so it's in a sense sort of lecture notes, and I would like to offer that as the framework for the discussion, which doesn't have to conform to the structural notes, and I'm happy to engage hopefully with as many as we can with a lot of time that we have. So if you look back, one finds that references to setting up a state where justice, governance, political interest, true religiosity obtained go back in history. For example, a commission of 30 set up a new constitution after the fall of Athens in 404 BC. Socrates, deemed by the oracle at Delphi to be the wisest man in Greece, would ask his interlocutors what they meant when they used ethical terms such as justice or fairness. Plato, in his criticism of democracy, noted that the common man is devoid of knowledge and experience, which can lead him to make bad decisions based on impulse, sentiment, or prejudice. While such an disadvantage may be overcome through good leadership, the likelihood of bad leadership is more likely in democracy. Fast forwarding to our own time, the American search for recreating the world in its own image got a practical start after the end of World War II. The total defeat of Germany and Japan and their occupation by the victorious Allies offered a unique opportunity for radical transformation of these societies. The state would be governed by a constitution where the destructive impulses of an elite or philosophy could be tempered with a built-in checks and balances system. Re-education of the young through examination of past regime successes would inculcate a new generation that would be unlikely to repeat the mistakes of the previous one. Delivery of US assistance through the Marshall Plan, passed by the US Congress in 1948 and signed by President Truman, provided the greatest transfer of resources and galvanized the recovery of war-torn Western Europe and created extensive links between European and American governments, civil servants, trade unions, etc. The US paid $17.6 billion in 1948 dollars, approximately $187.6 billion today, for the Marshall Plan and other assistance at the time. Contrast this to today's expenditures by the United States in Afghanistan alone since 2001, noted to be upwards of $2.35 trillion. Of course, this sum includes the heavy costs of military engagement, approximately $87 billion spent on standing up the Afghan security force, plus the follow-on nation-building effort and democracy promotion. More than $25 billion was spent on economic development alongside $30 billion for reconstruction programs, including for education, health, and refugee assistance. We need to begin by examining the nature of democracy promotion in US foreign policy before drawing conclusions as to what worked and what did not, and why. The end of the Second World War, accompanied by Soviet hostility and communist challenges. The end of the Soviet Empire came at the hands of US-supported Afghan Mujahideen, who mounted a challenge to Russian occupation of their country. As Soviet armies drew back across the so-called Friendship Bridge on the Amu Darya on February 15, 1989, I recall the excitement in the White House earlier under President Ronald Reagan, who championed the end of Soviet occupation for military supplies and training for Afghan fighters known then as the Mujahideen. Even as presidential rhetoric soared, there were no real plans for follow-on presence. President Reagan challenged the Soviet Union closer to home. On June 12, 1987, standing before the 12-foot high wall that symbolized totalitarian control on a visit to Berlin, he exhorted a weakened Soviet leadership with his famous call, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Reagan believed that this wall will fall, for it cannot withstand fate, it cannot withstand truth, and the wall cannot withstand freedom. When the wall did crumble in 1989 November, Jim Baker, who was a key figure in the Reagan and H.W. Bush presidencies, was moved to note, quote, "I would find it hard to hold back tears of joy as a trickle of people seeking freedom in the West turned into a torrent," unquote. Here then was a confirmation of freedom's fall, and the fact that given a chance, democracy was a force that drew people towards freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the success of European reconstruction and integration after World War II seemed to prove conclusively that US foreign policy would benefit from pursuit of worldwide trends in the unipolar world of the new century by supporting democracy building. I would like, hopefully in the Q&A period, we can get into how Eastern Europe and going back to the 56 uprising in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and even subsequently, the whole movement for freedom and democracy kind of reinforced the feeling that given half a chance, this is what people want and this is how they will move. As the US-led war in Afghanistan aimed to destroy Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden continued, the invasion of Iraq came to be the place where the US would rebuild a better world of participatory democracy. As the rationale of finding and destroying Iraq's weapons of mass destruction fizzled, democracy promotion became the raison d'etre of the costly engagement. Since democracy would give a role to 50% of the Iraqi population, it's women, US focus on helping women resonated. The right to choose would in a new Iraq and Afghanistan supplant Saddam Hussein or the Taliban's fiat, and it was believed that would restore human dignity. American leaders understood the difficulty in such a program, but felt it important to point out that the global trend was in favor of democracy expansion. For example, celebrating the 20th anniversary of the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, President George W. Bush noted that in the 1970s, there were 40 democracies in the world. At the end of the 20th century, there were 120 democracies in the world, and more were likely to come as the world witnessed the swiftest advance of freedom in the 2,500-year story of democracy. Credit for the expansion of the democratic wave was supported by the fact that the world's most influential nation itself was a democracy. As Bush said, liberty is both the plan of heaven for humanity and the best hope for progress here on earth. There was a firm assumption that the advance of freedom leads to peace. As the effort of democracy building became part of the integral US foreign policy pursuits, allies wondered if Washington's assumptions were unrealistic, given the uneven state of institutional structures for promoting democracy globally. The president rejoined that freedom was not a prize to be awarded to those who met Western standards, but instead offered a path of progress. Progress was based on cooperation, free exchange of ideas, the peaceful resolution all enabling a nation to move towards democracy. The Muslim world, with its muddled history of autocratic leaders, made the choice of the region as a focus for democracy promotion obvious. US foreign policy focused interest and resources with a genuine belief that the outcome warranted the commitment, and that given the region's wartime history, the advance of freedom would lead to peace. So in evaluating the record, I find that the backdrop of success in post-war Germany and Japan, promoting a democratic order did not translate into similar change in Afghanistan and Iraq, two places where the US was most actively directly involved. The reasons are obvious. First, the former were homogeneous societies with their own history, but also countries that took the US into a world war. New constitutions were written after total defeat of each. American occupation lasted a long time, and to this day, US military prisons still exist in Germany and in Japan, respectively. The definition of victory each in Afghanistan and Iraq was different from the outset. The objectives were limited to the destruction of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and prevention of any future terrorist attack against the US homeland. Terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 against New York, Washington, Pennsylvania made an incredibly lasting impact in terms of the destruction wrought and the unexpected nature of the attack, as had indeed the surprise attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor much earlier in 1941. In Iraq, US foreign policy emphasized the removal of weapons of mass destruction. Democracy promotion was a fallback position when no WMD were found. There was the expectation that Saddam Hussein's fall would bring out great political engagement. American occupation, therefore, need not be a long one, and a free and democratic Iraq would pull together to rule under a system of compromise. Yet that did not happen in either country, despite expenditures of US blood and treasure. In Afghanistan, tribal, ethnic, and sectarian allegiances far outweighed any desire for centralized authority imposed from outside. King Zahir Shah ruled Afghanistan in the past with a loose central structure, leaving the provinces basically as ethnic governments. The long-held tradition of finding common ground, when absolutely needed, was handled through periodic jirgas, where tribal leaders came together to compromise. Unlike Europe and Japan, US policymakers acknowledged early in the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan that the US presence would not be permanent. Residual forces would be withdrawn based on ground reality. These were seen as Bush's wars, not the response of an existentially threatening threat. Secondly, there was the problem of time. As former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates notes in the case of Iraq, there was a Washington clock and a Baghdad clock, and the two moved at very different speeds. Our forces needed time to make the surge and our broader plan work, and the Iraqis needed time for political reconciliation. But much of Congress, most of the media, and a growing number of Americans had lost patience with the war. US foreign policy must be conducted within cycles of presidential elections. I saw this personally from my White House work for the 1984, 1988, and 2004 elections. Basically, a major foreign policy decision must be well along the path of implementation in the first 2 years of either term, as competition for presidential time truly escalates thereafter. Staying power gets sacrificed as events turn bitter, as is likely in war. Despite the efforts to offer incentives such as development, especially for women's empowerment in Afghanistan and in Iraq, America was an occupying force. Lack of familiarity with the region, religion, culture, and even the history of the occupied countries made for mistakes that could have been avoided and gave the US a reputation of an occupying force lacking finesse towards the local population. For example, as Bob Gates writes regarding the complexities of operation in Afghanistan as serious vulnerabilities, he says, quote, one was civilian casualties. Every incident was a strategic defeat, often caused and always manipulated by the Taliban, and then magnified by Karzai, who was then the president. Another was our thoughtless treatment of the Afghans in routine encounters, including the US and coalition military vehicles barreling down roads, scattering animals and scaring people. Gates goes on to know that the US occupation often disrespected Afghan culture or Islam, failed to cultivate elders who were leaders in their respective tribes. US worked with Afghan officials who were known as corrupt. Further, that development work occurred without routine collaboration with appropriate Afghans. Non-governmental organizations that grew in partnership with the US often lack in-country expertise. They created a cadre of decision makers along with an army of outside contractors who oversaw the work Afghans should have been trained for. As we reflect in 2021 in financial accounting of the war in Afghanistan, over $2.35 trillion, it actually boggles my mind. Beyond strictly military expenditures, unthinkable amounts of cash in the form of US dollars flowed in the pipeline. This is a poor country, where it was all too clear from the outset, based on past record of US engagement with Afghanistan, the term in Afghanistan, US term in Afghanistan would end with American withdrawal. Those who had access to the funds seem to have availed themselves of more than their share. US corporations based along the Washington Beltway also prospered with lucrative contracts for services rendered in Afghanistan and Iraq. This was not the Marshall Plan model of post-war Europe. Afghanistan and Iraq were determined to be the war of necessity and the war of choice, respectively, by the foreign policy establishment in the US. Afghanistan did not have the capacity to absorb the annual inflow spent in the country from the estimated 2.35 trillion. The Afghan GDP was 4 billion in 2001, with a very limited institutional base in Afghanistan. The rush to development and democracy created a cadre of suppliers, contractors, support through warlords, and even the Taliban for allowing the work to proceed. Expenditure by the US in Afghanistan over 20 years amounted to approximately $290 million a day. Presidential credibility suffered in management of the wars. Afghanistan, after 20 years of war, led to chaotic withdrawal in Iraq, which did not possess the WMD cachet, which led to the US invasion. And it became an unpredictable battleground with regional and sectarian tensions overwhelming the US knowledge and experience on the ground. An occupation with a huge green zone headquarters was both intrusive in its goals and remote in its capacity to govern. Afghanistan demonstrated too that changing ground realities, even as in US desire of building a more just society, were hampered by ignorance of Afghanistan's complexity, of its tribes, traditions, ethnic groups, power brokers, villages, and provincial rivalries. As a former Secretary of Defense and former Deputy CIA chief lamented in reference to US occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, our knowledge and our intelligence were woefully inadequate. We entered both countries oblivious to how little we knew. We mistook technological superiority for knowledge. So against that backdrop, looking forward, regardless of a polarized America, complicated international relationships, both post-Trump and COVID-19 pandemic, the US will remain the world's most powerful country. That status will not preclude challenges from other countries or non-state actors. How will the US react? The urge for the US to exert hegemonic power to achieve its global order and security may strike again. Can the possibility of American leadership in fostering a more secure world through a change in ground realities in unfriendly countries work? Could future administrations succeed in building international multilateral coalitions to achieve the goal? Frank Fukuyama points out that in the future, before other countries accept US leadership, they would have to be convinced not just that America was good, but that it was wise in its application of power, and through that wisdom, successful in achieving the ends it sets for itself. International skepticism and domestic fatigue with America's endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan will restrict future application of the doctrine of preemptive war. Even in its heyday, senior US leaders cautioned that preemptive action does not come at the beginning of a long chain of effort and must be very limited in its exercise. Will US foreign policy, with its current focus on limiting China's power projection and its economic inroads into nations that once were legitimate competition, arenas in the Cold War era, be able to resist the do-over model from reemerging. Democracy promotion and nation building is in the costly open way of the last 2 decades are likely to be a thing of the past, given the lack of demonstrable long-term gains. Throwing hundreds of millions of dollars a day into a country lacking basic institutional capacity does not buy security or stability. Building institutions takes time, but that will be a better use of resources. In my many forays over decades to many of the Muslim countries, I have informally in my interactions sought out views from people in all walks of life about the key components they desire from their government. Almost universally, 2 appear to be paramount: justice and good governance. Even the uneducated in the populace understand these concepts because they feel their absence. Both these attributes cannot be imposed by an invasion or an occupation. And because the length of US physical presence today in failed regimes which harbor terrorists is likely to be limited to expulsion of the same, promotion of democratic norms will require a different track to inculcate institutions that focus on these 2 issues, which remain, I think, the key. American funding would be better spent working with local individuals and leaders on how to move ahead. The US will have to be a partner, not an overlord. Recent US takeover involved physical military occupation, which then led to a search for local favorites to take over government, given US departure. One lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan is that occupation is not possible or productive. World War II is long behind us, and Germany and Japan were very different and treated so as well, as continued US military presence in both these sovereign nations demonstrates. The US cannot impose democracy even when likely half of the population, i.e. the women, will support us. As the return of the Taliban and the immediate attention on women indicates, institutional support for the traditional arbiters of the power system is needed. We need to be doing this as a routine part of our diplomatic in-country engagement. This can be done. I recall requesting US embassies around the globe to help us identify 10 key women leaders in their respective posts for the Secretary of State's Women Working, the Women Leaders Working Group. They did that in a remarkably short time. The complaint that I heard from various embassies was that asking for 10 was difficult because there were so many worthwhile candidates. We could put multi-year resources behind this kind of outreach and connectivity at the ground level for the United States, and train an in-country cadre of experts rather than exporting large contingents of Beltway consultants. Support for projects in the existing economic multilateral institutions that further capacity building on a permanent basis would also be important. Because in the end, these efforts supplement US needs and obviate future need for physical presence. The US is fortunate in that there are many non-governmental organizations which have geographical expertise and often a ground presence in countries of interest. Many of these organizations have worked in the field for a long time and understood that democracy in many countries, especially in the Muslim world, cannot replicate the American model of separation of powers. This may not be democracy as we understand it, but if progress on building the institutions which underpin democracy, such as participatory elections, free media, equal access for women, transparency to curtail corruption are possible, I think that is a good start. So I think an important point in this context is that while the US has an abiding belief in constitutional democracy as the source of all legitimacy, and an equal faith in the legitimacy of its own democratic institutions, this may not, in this sense, be translatable to all of the countries the US has an interest in. But just as Americans value sovereignty, others distrust it as a source of conflict. Multilateral institutions, I believe, offer an alternative model for civil society development, and these need not be a tool of last resort as happened in Iraq, when the US had no long-term follow-on action plan after the invasion. The UN already has a democracy fund, supervised by donor member states with growing links to civil society in key countries. Better use of its capacity offers an alternative to US ownership of democracy promotion elsewhere. Such an approach would complement the Biden administration's stated future approach of helping capacity building in Afghanistan from over the horizon. So finally, democracy promotion as a movement cannot be central to US foreign policy without some buy-in from existing varied power centers based on ethnicity and sectarian divides that may exist in any given country. The experience of the last quarter century ought to have taught us at least that. Thank you. I would like to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, criticism, any number of things. Should I?
Seat. So we can start with a question coming from our colleague Steve Krasner, who I'm sure you know, who's on Zoom. And he's asking, if the United States had implemented some of the policies that you discussed in the Middle East, do you think that the outcomes in Iraq and Afghanistan would have been more successful?
Well, depending on what we take as a successful outcome, it certainly couldn't have been any less successful. Because I think it would have created, first of all, I want to say hi to Steve, and nice to have him. I'm sorry about the Zoom word, but on the other hand, it allows me to connect up with colleagues and friends. So thank you, Steve, for that question. And it's a one that I don't have a glib answer for. It's worth pondering, but my response would be, if we had engagement over time with the local populace, we wouldn't have had to pull up and just come out and leave them at the mercy or whatever, because the locals would have certainly had the interactions to build support, working within the ethnic sectarian divides that exist both in Afghanistan and in Iraq. It's more poignant in Afghanistan because the situation is so dire currently. So I think the fact that the people we trained, helped get educated, in one sense, that was successful. It's created a cadre of workers, many of them women, who actually couldn't carry on the work of governments and governance when it is allowed. But the manner of our withdrawal, the kind of overnight end of support from going from 75% of the daily budget to 25%, kind of scattered our efforts needlessly, I think. So what the procedural sort of parameters were so haphazard, it made a continuity difficult. So I think it would have been different.
Right.
So Shireen, your talk covered, the last 30 years of my career. And we actually we actually need Mike McFall. We need somebody to channel Mike McFall, because this is. You're looking at me. Yeah. This is also something that's been one of his major preoccupations. So there's a lot of, there's a part that I completely agree with, which is why the Bush administration made the mistakes that it did. And I really do think that a lot of our friends, like Paul Wolfowitz and company, their last experience in government was in the 1980s under Reagan, in the fall of the Berlin Wall, when everything worked without the US lifting a finger, right? Yeah. That these countries, greeted democracy, joyfully, and crowds in the streets and so forth. And I really do think that they had this model in their minds, and that it would apply to other parts of the world, and it obviously, didn't work there. So I think that was a pretty clear mistake. But I want to ask a kind of version of Steve's question, because he just wrote a whole book. What does it make? How to make love to a despot, where he was. It's good stuff. Yeah, he was basically make an argument similar to yours that we needed to lower our expectations, and that from the standpoint of American foreign policy interests, it was really security and not democracy that was important. And therefore, you would need to compromise and accept outcomes that didn't look very morally appealing, but met that kind of minimal threshold. So, for example, in Egypt, he thinks we should support General Sisi, which is something that a lot of people around this table don't really want to live with. But that's the consequence. And so there are different versions of this. I mean, I think that, for example, we've never been actually interested in using military force to promote democracy. I can't think of a single intervention where that was the main motivation. It's all security based. And, I think what we were trying to do really in both Iraq and Afghanistan was not create democracy. It was just to have a state, a state that was not hostile and therefore could control terrorists on its territory. It actually worked in Iraq. Fareed Zakaria actually wrote a recent column saying that people don't understand that Iraq, it's not Afghanistan, it's more success, but Afghanistan, no question, was a total failure, even this minimal goal of creating the state. And so I guess the question I have is, how far do you want to take down these, how far do you want to lower these sites, in terms of what we ought to be aiming for? You want to go the Krasner route of basically saying, let's just worry about security interests and try to fulfill them in the kind of most minimal way and take the democracy part off the agenda? Or is there some other midpoint between Afghanistan and General Sisi that, that we should aim for?
And before you answer, this is a test of the Stanford emergency alert system. So that's the noise outside and probably some thinking that will happen on our phones. So apologies in advance.
We don't have to get up and run and
No,
We don't
it's
have
just,
to.
we were warned and you just respond, yes, you got it.
Fred, one of the lessons that I take away is that we cannot have a generalized, wide sort of set of commitments on this issue. It probably comes down to mostly country by country. And we overlooked that briefly. I mean, all the way, I think, some ways through Arab Spring, because we thought, big movement, global kind of reach. But then we do have to settle for the security interests. I think the reason in many ways Iraq had more of a follow-on activity, as Zakaria's piece and others indicate, because it had elections. The guy who we hated the most is become now, because he's got clout through numbers and power, has become acceptable. But that's because in Iraq, what led to that, firstly, they were a more developed political society. That was one of the criticisms that Iraqis, I mean, I went in and out of the war zone because I was helping build this children's cancer hospital in Basra. And we would have these discussions with political leaders, particularly the women who were sort of, and I traveled all over with the military because of the effort of what we were trying to do in Basra. And the point they were making is, they had a certain amount of institutional activity in Iraq far preceding the US involvement.
Like 3,000 years roughly.
And that in fact, which included women's participation, professional workers, no hijab, I mean, a whole lot of things that we actually caused regression on. But what the demise of Saddam Hussein loosened and removed the singular control over participatory systems, and that enabled what's followed in Iraq on its own pace to take place. So in that sense, his removal and his total control through the Ba'athist Party and all of that made things hard. Afghanistan was and still remains a very, very basic structure. I remember traveling by bus, which was a horrifying thing at that to my parents in 1969 over the Khyber Pass into Kabul. I had to pretend to be, at that time I wasn't an old woman like I am now, but I had to wear a chadar pretend because it was on a bus, and a public bus actually. And I remember it was the equivalent of 30 cents going and 50 cents coming back because it was downhill and uphill and stuff. And all along, even in 69, the bus was stopped. And what would be the precursors of the Taliban, minus the Arabs, because there wasn't an Arab, it was just culturally Afghan, would stop the bus and each passenger had to pay 2 Pakistani rupees as tax to go through to the next checkpoint. And this is an old system, that they've been doing for centuries, and they didn't collect rupees, but they collect something else. And going into Kabul in 69, it made Peshawar look like Paris. And if you've been to Peshawar, which Frank, I think you have, that's saying something. So it's a very, very basic sort of structural society. And which is why, of course, Bin Laden and all these people found refuge there. And maybe given time, had we worked through not just pronouncements and money, but actually working with the tribal system, because our idea was that jiggers would become parliaments and pass laws that would hold. It's never been a federal or a centralized system. So that wasn't going to happen, really be possible, particularly given our own timeline. Our history is 4 years at best. And you've got to show results in 2 years. People out there still remember what the United States did in 1950, and then which part of presidential records all over the country here. So the mismatch in sequencing, the mismatch in just a sense of time makes it very hard to do anything except develop a long-term strategy, which you cannot do without a presence, but you can at least do with active partners and allowing them to kind of be part of the existing structure. You cannot overthrow all those things in one time in a country that sort of looks to many people like the 17th century. It is very hard.
All right, Catherine.
Sure. So interesting talk, and these are obviously issues a lot of us here have thought a lot about and worked a lot on. I should say I'm a Russia specialist. This December is 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, December 1991. This year is 10 years since the collapse, since the Arab Spring. And of course, this year, is what happened in Afghanistan. So when we think about democracy and democracy promotion, my question is, have we just basically failed?
Sorry,
haven't we just basically failed to the extent
across the board?
Well, right. And the reason I'm asking is because a lot of people ask me, right, as well. So I think it's good to have a conversation about it. The Marshall Plan, tiny compared to what we did in Afghanistan, and yet we were much successful. So a lot of people would say the starting conditions are completely different. And the goal in Afghanistan was not necessarily to build democracy, but it was to build a state. Maybe we failed there too.
I don't think we separated the two.
Sure.
I mean, we assume
Sure.
that democracy will help us build the state.
Right.
I don't think there was a bifurcation over there.
So the question is really, Steve Krausner, I see, would say, we don't really know how to do this. And I think he'd say it exactly that way. And so what we should aim for is good enough governance as opposed to democracy in these places. And then maybe at some point, democracy will come once people get a certain amount of prosperity. So basically modernization theory. So that may be, but the other problem is, of course, and I'm thinking about Biden's, what is it going to be called? Conference on Democracy, Summit on Democracy. So we're hardly in a place right now in the United States in the wake of January 6th and the last 4 years, some will argue, to actually hold such a summit because we have to clean things up at home, right? So is it true that we just can't do this and that basically our efforts have failed over the last 30 years? Or are we misreading global support for democracy? So as we were talking, I was looking at the 2019 Pew survey, which is democratic attitudes from like 34, 35 countries. And although there is, as they put it, democratic rights are popular globally, but the commitment to them is not always strong. Many are frustrated with how democracy functions, and especially those who are joining right-wing populist movements. So how do we combat that when that's exactly what's happening here in the United States, and we've sort of lost legitimacy in the wake of 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union? Only Ukraine, other than the Baltics, looking at encouraging their 10 years since the Arab Spring, Tunisia, just the last 2 weeks, and then Afghanistan. Is this something we can do?
Well, I mean, it's not the first time I'd agree with you, Gaza, but in a sense, we have failed. But that doesn't, but I'm not sure that translates into, democracy, desire for freedom has disappeared or will disappear. I mean, there's something to the fact that people prefer not to be sat on.
Mm-hmm. But the attitudes.
But as
in
a
the last 5
policy of the
years
United
changed.
States government, we're not really equipped to do that, particularly since we don't have long staying power.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't. So rather than flash in for other reasons, security, strategic mostly, and then flash out with this, it's okay, then you throw money after the issue. That aspect of implementation, I don't think works. It certainly doesn't work in the current situation where, I never thought in my lifetime I would be seeing programs that are called Democracy in Crisis, USA. And I thought, what? I mean, this is happening here.
If we have one.
So the high, the high road of lecturing to the universe about how it all works and system of checks and balances and equal representation and all of these things suddenly come to have sort of a more complicated existing here in the world's oldest democracy. I also, going back to the democracy, the summit of democracies, it's interesting because I guess 17 years in Washington, and most of them at the White House leaves you with at least a cadre of co-workers who sort of talk about this. And so my question to them was, well, obviously you have, who are you going to invite? I mean, they're obvious, the usual suspects. And then what's on the agenda? Everybody gets up and gives their 2 cents worth of why you should do this and why we do that. I'm not sure this is the time even we can be talking about us here. So then the response comes, well, this is to showcase how America, even with its problems, is so different from China, which seems to be our current, sort of focus. That it used to be Soviet Union, now it's Russia to some extent. It's really China-centric. And to demonstrate to them the drawing power of the free world, and nobody wants to really quite say that yet, but I mean, that's the sort of thing. But then again, there's a point that if you're going to try and embarrass the Chinese with the talk about the Uyghurs, okay, which is going to be a big part of this whole thing. Well, how do you do that and not even mention that the most practicing democracy, India, has had the Kashmiris locked up for 3 years?
Yeah.
The Indians whom I know, because I was born in India, so I mean, and that's the South Asian mafia, is the South Asian mafia for the rest of your life. They say, well, the US doesn't even raise that issue in private conversations. So, I mean, and there are more Kashmiris around than Uyghurs. And India is going to be the star performer. How do you bring in that into the discussion on the Summit of the Democracy and not even mention Kashmir? And so we pick and choose anyway. But let's not be so blatant that we kind of destroy the model we're trying to promote.
So would you not have this?
I would not, unless I mean, from the discussions I hear, maybe there's some Einstein working on it or somebody appear or resolve with a very pithy equation.
It's actually our friend Shanti Kalatil that's the one responsible for it.
I mean, how on earth, what are you going to talk about? I mean, you've got the January 6th Commission, you've got the divisions in the United States, people are really going to focus on the Uyghurs? And for this, you need a president to come and hold a 2-day summit? So I don't know. I mean, I think we do. I mean, maybe that's just in our DNA because we're America, we need to be grand. And
it's part maybe of the America is back kind of
yeah,
slogan. Yeah.
we have a Build Back Better. But fine, build back better, but you can't talk about the
Better
weakness
do it
unless
first,
you,
yeah.
unless you talk about the Kashmiris, I'm sorry. I mean, you know, and you're talking about the only functional, you know, and India is a representative democracy, it has been a secular democracy, but what's happening with the 175 million Muslims in India? They're not
Right,
just,
yeah.
they're not just be swept, well, it's Modi and he's, you know, he's kind of myopic. But, you know, it's taking down a system that has worked, one of the rare ones that has worked. And it's not enough to say let these people go to Pakistan because most of those 175 million don't even know Pakistan.
Right.
So you've got to, I think, be careful. So I wouldn't say America has failed, but we need to change the way we approach it. Fortunately, we're exhausted, so we're not likely to jump into too many things actively, I think, right now. And that may be a good thing. Maybe it's time to just sit back and let's see what bubbles up. But the societies
Our
themselves.
Ukrainian friends would say there's a place.
But you know, but if you talk to people, whether in the Arab world, the South Asian world, or any of the other worlds, justice and governance is important. It's important in this country. That's what surfaced. And those you cannot impose. So we have to kind of use our expertise, our NGO access. We've got to use, I think, partner with countries who actually understand those societies better than us. Money, throwing money isn't going to be the solution. It is fine because you don't have it.
So we have a few other questions. I want to make sure that we have many others actually. So let's move on, Marissa.
I had a suggestion for a new way forward out of just listening to you. We've focused on these very difficult cases, Afghanistan, Iraq, but there's all sorts of, you know, low-hanging fruit where we can make a real difference in democracy. And then if we have these ideas of democratic diffusion, if more of the world is filled with democracies, maybe it'd be a better place. Why don't we do democracy promotion in Latin America? Why don't we do democracy promotion in Southeast Asia, in Africa, places that maybe aren't, you know, coming, we're not trying to build the state, but it seems like there we could be successful.
Well, but you know, we have to understand that it's not going to be a kind of unidirectional progress. Even in Southeast Asia, you know, Philippines, other places, Brazil and Latin America. I mean, these things go, movement is there's progress and it takes one change of leadership. Even in India, I mean, Modi's done a lot of good
I
things,
guess
but
I'm thinking, like, could we do something to prevent that, to strengthen these democracies so that they're not so susceptible to one change of leadership? That would be easier than trying to rebuild societies.
well, I think that you're right. I mean, you're not going to do sort of engineering, societal engineering, but it's not that easy to prevent either. If you're talking about democratic change based on freedom to elect your leaders, you may end up with something that's not right. We have to accept that. They're not going to be all kind of democratic in our mold. And I'm not sure it's necessarily low-hanging fruit. None of it is low-hanging fruit. That requires patience, time, and knowledge.
Yes, I guess that might be wrong, but easier than Afghanistan.
I do.
My question is very similar to Marissa's actually, because like I was thinking about Tunisia because I'm always thinking about Tunisia, I guess. I mean, it was definitely a very low-hanging fruit because I mean, it wasn't a heterogeneous society like in Iraq, or there was definitely a functioning state. But even in Tunisia, it looks like the democracy promotion failed as of this summer. So what did the US do there? Did they try to promote democracy in Tunisia? And why do you think it might have failed? And also, it might have been good for the US to show that like something in Middle East basically works, because the history of the US in democracy promotion in the Middle East is very bad. I mean, let's look at Egypt. Egypt stayed as an autocracy for a long time because of the military collaboration with the Egyptian army and the US army. So, like, why don't we, or why don't the US not be at all work on these low-hanging fruits? This is a showcase, maybe.
Well, I think Tunisia was obviously different, and because it, you know, it all basically in some way started there. There was a huge amount of hope. But I think one of the reasons for it, one of the things I would recommend in any of these potential countries, because we don't know where the next Tunisia pops up, right, is at least develop a sort of The US is a global power with a global presence. I don't mean just in the number of, aircraft carriers. I'm talking about a diplomatic presence in country. And it was really after a fair amount of soul searching, I thought, we have usually, in my experience, knowledgeable, dedicated, in-ground personnel at every embassy. We've spent a lot of time on the security links because that's often the reason we are there, and those issues, the political military issues, are paramount in many, many posts. But we have a presence anywhere we have these officials anyway. We probably need to really focus on creating one part of every one of our embassies that works knowledgeably and at least understands the local civil society structure. We have a very extensive system of what are called foreign service nationals that are citizens of a host country that work with embassy personnel. But my experience has been there's the FSN and then there's the foreign service. And I think that perhaps some of the Washington-based people who get posted there ought to be also becoming familiar so that if the opening, and they would have a sense if they're a year to the ground, okay, something's changing here. What's changing here? Who are the leaders? You already know these people. You understand them. You have to listen as to what will be helpful and what will not. We cannot, it's nice to live in Washington, but we don't necessarily know how best to help. And you can't have an occupation of force going in on each of the issues. But if there's a possibility for change, for institutional training, I think one of the nice programs that existed, and I hope that it still does, is the parliamentarian sort of exchange between the US. Of course, now there's such a split in the US Congress, I'm not sure anybody's coming or whatever's happening. But that's an exposure to what does it mean? What does governance mean? What does delivery of services mean? So if you have assistance, have it targeted to what the needs are, not throwing in huge amounts for change that that's just disappears.
All right, I have Brett and then Scott, and then a few more.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it immensely. All right, so I was thinking about how I would summarize your core claim tonight over the dinner table with my spouse, and it seems to me that I think towards the end you said that democracy promotion can't be central to U.S. foreign policy without local buy-in, right? Without local buy-in.
Oh yes.
Right.
Yes.
So then I was thinking about local buy-in, right? I mean, it's one of these things that sort of like, yes, it sounds great, right? It sounds certainly, we probably shouldn't, topple governments, without sort of identifying sort of partners in the country that can lead. But then I was thinking about, Central Africa, the part of the world that I know best. And I guess I'm thinking, is it really, are we really confident that we can identify the kind of local buy-in that could sort of help, a new government sort of take sort of legitimate steps towards democracy? And in particular, I guess I'm thinking about, multi-ethnic societies with long histories of cross-ethnic violence, right? And in some sense, the forces and the interests that sort of a set of new political institutions inevitably unleashes, right? And so then, it seems to me, given how hard it is to kind of anticipate some of these new forces, can we really be confident that we can identify the kind of local buy-in that, in your view, would be essential to helping kind of shepherd along a legitimate democratic transition?
Well,
I guess I'm just skeptical about as a criterion in the first place, given how difficult it would be to identify.
I don't think it's that difficult over time. If you sort of land, using the A for airborne and say, what are the 7 people that I need to go find? Yes. But we have an in-country presence. It shouldn't be that hard. I, of course, have my own formula for how you can speed up the process on the ground. It doesn't have to be led by America. It can be led by anybody. I think our natural partners in trying to find good governance and justice are the women. It's been my experience in my work as well as just where I'm from, that, and people know who the doers are. And, you know, and those are the links. That's why I think that if you have an in-country presence in the way of embassies, which you have everywhere,
Sure.
those are the people who really understand who the doers are. It's not that difficult in most societies. Afghanistan is complicated because it's a totally tribal society, but even there, it is not impossible. So then the issue is, how do you promote with a light touch the doers, help them build societal support, because I mean, it's still a male-dominated world. I mean, that's not just in the Muslim world, everywhere. So how and they have, and you've got to be guided by them. We don't have the answers. We just don't. And we don't have the longevity of attention. And now I don't think we even have the resources that people are willing to commit to it. So, and very little public support. So things are going to be much harder in any case. So why not just start the basics? And that's at the ground level. And I think partnering with women can make a difference. We've tried to do without it, and it hasn't worked.
So I will go ahead and take, we have 4 questions left as far as I know. We'll take 2 at a time. Is that all right with you? All right, so Scott and Marcel, and then once you're done, you can answer, and then we'll end with Hisham and Aisha.
I'll try to be brief, but mine's more of a comment, and then the question is, do you have thoughts on this? Is the question, which is about what are the hidden costs of fighting a war for 20 years for the sake of, partly for the sake of democracy, has been a harm on our own democracy, in my view. The thought is based in part on reading Catherine Ballou's really superb book, Bringing the War Back Home, which is about Vietnam veterans joining right-wing militias and creating the right-wing terrorist movement leading to the Oklahoma City bombing, which she demonstrates was not a lone wolf phenomenon at all, was something. Here we have January 6th, which was overrepresented by US military who had fought in these wars. Ashley Babbitt was killed as a ex-Air Force guard, ex-nuclear power plant guard. And I haven't seen this linkage between our fighting forces overseas and the increase in right-wing terrorism, which the FBI now says is the largest terrorist threat against the United States, be as emphasized as I think it should be. And my question then is am I right in thinking that? And B, why are people who are interested in democracy promotion more focused on this particular problem in terms of democracy diminishment at home?
All right, Marcel?
We are at CDRL. We're about to talk about.
Right, so you brought up the experience of Europe after the Second World War. You talked about the Marshall Plan and democracy there, but you didn't talk about the failed democracies in the Eastern Bloc, what became the Eastern Bloc. I mean, because they had elections and then, so there was an attempt for democracy there. There was very local buy-in because they didn't vote, many of them didn't vote majority for Congress, and nonetheless it Congress won. So this is a situation where it's not just about local buy-in, it's also about regional powers. And so clearly in the Middle East, obviously, you know, now it's just a playground for Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia. The Emirates, it's in Lebanon now, it's Syria, it's Yemen, it's Libya, it was they played a role in Sisi, they played a role now in Sudan. So regional powers, some of them are strong allies and been allies for a very long time, and they are clearly not democracies, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So now, I wanted to raise the issue of Pakistan with Afghanistan, because in 2001, when we defeated Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, they sought refuge in Pakistan, and you know, Osama managed to hide there for a long time, but fully protected by the ISI. You didn't talk about that. ISI was helping the Taliban. They had refuge in Quetta and all that. So Pakistan really wants to play a role in Afghanistan. Since we were not letting them do that while we were there for 20 years, they basically chose this alternative. support the Taliban, hope they come back, and basically have their puppeteer role in the background. How can we, at the summit, we were funding Pakistan, large amounts of money at the time that they were actually sheltering Al-Qaeda and continued for a long time. The Taliban, I don't understand that. Could you talk about that?
Go ahead. If I could take Scott's comment first. Actually, Scott, I think you've got a very good point, because I have often wondered why it is we're not talking about phenomena of these, of the military and others disillusioned for whatever reasons, reacting domestically within the US the way they have. I mean, it's quite startling. Given, you know, both the image of the military and the image of the United States as a free and fair country. And I don't have an answer to that. It's other than to say, I'm quite startled of the, even in the post-January 6th analyses and commentaries, you don't get much of that. And whether this is because it's such an anomaly that people think it's a one-time event, crystallized by the polarization of the previous few years. Therefore, this is something that came up, happened, it's over. Or whether it's sort of a warning sign of what's coming down the pike. And I don't have an answer to that. I mean, you probably have a better answer than I do, but it is worth noting and it's worth worrying about. And it's just not, even if you look at any of the coverage of these events because of the commission and examination, it's barely figures.
I hope this comes out more in the commission, but I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it, and in the actual coverage of it, at least, I mean, I'm not privy to the conversations, but I just, you know, what is shown and what one reads. And and even in that commentary, there isn't any focus on the why. How did this happen? And what does it mean for the political system going forward? Given existing conditions and divisions. So you know, I'm now that I pay more attention, and if I come up with in my own opinion, what I think is going on, I stay in touch on it because I think it can have a lot of repercussions, which I'm glad you mentioned. You know, the Pakistan story probably goes longer than the time we have. The issue of Al-Qaeda and the occupation of Afghanistan and ISI and the Taliban and the rest of it. Look, what you said about the regional power structures, whether it be Eastern Europe, whether it's regression in Turkey or in Poland or in Hungary, I mean, there are lots of countries that things were going better, and that's kind of, we had an assumption that you open up to participatory democracy, you lift the controls, and things get better. It may go down a little, but by and large, countries remain open, free, doesn't exactly look like that. And democracy, and the current crisis in America probably indicates that even in the safest of democracies, nothing can be taken for granted. So, and I think the Afghanistan issue fits in well with your comment about regional powers. So my own view is that for the Pakistan-Afghan relations have been complicated because of the region in which these two countries exist. Pakistan does not want, cannot afford a two-front situation. They have an existential threat with India, they believe, and surprisingly, the Indians also, although they'll Pakistan as a thing, but there's a lot of military focused right on that border, and they don't want a two-front situation. So, there were times in American diplomacy, and I was part of that, and post actually governs life also. But I always thought that if you get some, if not better relations, at least a cold peace between India and Pakistan, it would benefit both. Because it's ridiculous what's going on 70 years later. And until the US and the US sort of, there's a mantra that we cite, we don't really want to do anything. And not, or even to signal, because US signals matter in many parts of the world. So for Pakistan, however they can secure their northern border, they will do it. I mean, you can't expect a country not to. And I think that the context of the regional thing, and we should look at that. We don't. I mean, we take each example as a unique example of interaction. And maybe when it goes back, I mean, I'm not saying go back to the Baghdad Pact of the 50s, but there was some sense in it because they were interacting kind of relationships. Instead, our focus is more we have a Cold War with China, so these are the things we will do. We have a Cold War with Iran, therefore these are the countries we will work with. That's a little different from what you're describing.
Right.
So.
Oh, sorry to cut you off. No, I'm so sorry. So Shreen, we have another meeting that's coming into the room. I'm going to ask Hisham and Aisha to take their questions off the air, as we would say in radio speak. But thank you so much for this wonderful talk, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for being here, for your questions. I learned a lot.